Okay, folks, where are we? Yes, we're in Corinthians, chapter 24 of the commentary by Rushdoony, and the chapter is entitled Faith and History. 24. Faith and History. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 5. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Paul now leaves the personal context for the historical, going back to Moses and the Exodus. The meaning of that history he now explains, saying, I would not, brethren, have you ignorant. Verse 1. He then does something which is extremely important. He refers to, quote, our fathers, end quote, who were with Moses. This is an important fact because many of the Corinthian church members were not Jews, they were Gentiles. Still, because they were at least outwardly in the covenant, they must see Moses and the peoples of the 12 tribes as their forefathers. A true Christian is a member of the Israel of God. Galatians chapter 6, verse 16. Now, this is an important fact in all Paul's epistles. The dispensationalists make a difference between those who are of the Gentiles and those who are of the Jews, and supposedly God has something planned even for the ungodly, which is nonsense. Jews and Gentiles are heirs of the promises of God in terms of covenant faithfulness. The inheritance of all who are in the covenant of Christ is the whole of the history, law, and the promise of the covenants with Abraham and Moses. The Old Testament is our book, our history. The Christian thus belongs to a long heritage of faith, the Old Testament history. Verse 1. We may have been converted only yesterday, or our family may have become Christian only in this century, but Moses, Abraham, all of them, they are our forefathers. It is our history. All these peoples of the 12 tribes passed through the Red Sea and under the cloud. Verse 1. These, quote, were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. In the sea. Under the sea. Under the sea, you and me. Passed through the Red Sea and under the cloud. Verse 1. These, quote, were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Verse 2. This is an important and startling statement. That is, to be, quote, baptized into Moses, end quote, both in the Red Sea crossing and in the guidance by the pillar and the cloud. The gifts of God's grace were poured out upon them and upon us. The meaning of baptized here is not immersed nor dipped, but rather saturated. I lost focus. Hocus pocus, I lost focus. Baptized here is not immersed nor dipped, but rather saturated. God, in the wilderness journey, saturated the people with His grace, with His mercy. And we are to see that, as applying to us, God has saturated us with His mercy, with His so great salvation. The whole... For some reason... God has saturated us with His mercy, with His so great salvation. The whole of the wilderness journey gave evidence of the great and radical blessings and care of the covenant. Their baptism was far greater than ours. Instead of being a brief immersion, aspersion, or sprinkling, it was 40 years long of covenant care and grace, a baptism into a remarkable relationship with God. Moreover, they did all eat the same spiritual meat, end quote. Manna, verse 3. Their food was supernaturally provided. Their privileges were remarkable, far greater than anything even the early church could dream of, because it was 40 years long, a continuing miracle. In addition, they did all drink the same spiritual drink, quote, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Verse 4. In Exodus 17, we read of a rock that provided Israel with water. In biblical typology, rock means God. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 31, rock refers to the false gods, where Moses said, "For their rock is not as our rock." In other instances, it refers to the living God. Here, it was not the physical rock which, when struck, provided water that followed them, but Jesus Christ, the rock of ages. Toplady, who knew Toplady,
should be a top lady.
water that followed them, but Jesus Christ, the rock of ages. Toplady knew his Deuteronomy when he wrote Rock of Ages. Thus, their wilderness leader and companion was God the Son. We have, therefore, a remarkable history cited for Israel in the wilderness. It began with their deliverance from Egypt, then the Red Sea crossing and miracle, the manna and the water, a great witness to covenant faithfulness by God in amazing ways. Then comes the devastating climax. But with many of them, God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Verse 5. Paul's understatement is a superb one. All knew the history, and that only Joshua and Caleb entered the promised land. The others of the original peoples who left Egypt, the adults, died in the wilderness for their unbelief. Let's mush all the words together like a real monkey. All knew the history, and that only Joshua and Caleb entered the promised land. The others of the original peoples who left Egypt, the adults, died in the wilderness for their unbelief. Moses, old and weary, was given a view of the land before his death. The implications of this must be considered carefully. God sentenced to death an entire generation for their unbelief. Paul is not citing this event for merely rhetorical purposes, but in grim earnestness. If Israel was contemptuous of its privileges and paid a price for it, how much more so are those who have the witness of Christ's atonement? They have seen much more plainly and openly the purposes of God. They have seen the central act of history. How dare they despise it? In Hebrews, we are clearly told that even as Israel had an exodus, so we too have an exodus. We have to move out of this world of sin, create the promised land according to the purposes of God. The ultimate promised land is a new heavens and a new earth. But there is a problem. It is the habit of men to look back on past history and see it as a ladder to the present, and the finality of history is seen as just beyond them. This attitude can be called apocalypse now, or at the latest,
Dun, 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 dun.
it can be called apocalypse
A paralypse now.
is just beyond them. This attitude can be called apocalypse now, or at the latest, very soon. We want the end now. Haven't we suffered enough, God? Give us the new heavens and the new earth tomorrow. Rapture us. Whatever you do, deliver us. We want apocalypse now. This is a view very common in the church, also among the us. We want apocalypse now. This is a view very common in the church, also common among humanists. When the United Nations was in San Francisco, California, shortly after World War II, the apocalypse now mentality was very prevalent among intellectuals and university professors. A ticket to the organising meetings was seen as a rare privilege, a privilege to be present at the birth of a new world order. One professor learned Russian, being a superb linguist, in order to follow the proceedings. To be a part of the final order is a heady privilege and a deadly temptation. Israel succumbed readily to it, although warned by Amos that the Lord God could readily raise up the Ethiopians to supplant them as a chosen people. Amos chapter 9 verse 7. The church has been guilty of the same evil of apocalypse now, in particular European and American churches. God can readily and easily supplant them with Asian and African Christians, not out of any merit, but by his sovereign grace. The finality is not with Israel nor the church, but with the triune God and his kingdom. To read the New Testament and its message of finality in terms of ourselves is wrong. Our faith must be Christ-centered, not church-centered. Paul gives the... I had to beep that out there, sorry about that. Our faith must be Christ-centered, not church-centered. Paul gives the example of the presumption of... Wrong. Our faith must be Christ-centered, not church-centered. Paul gives the example of the presumption of Israel to warn against the presumption of the Corinthians and others. Israel was barely into the wilderness before its arrogant demands on God were made, and the church was still close to the cross when the Corinthians made their unconcern with God's law and their concern with their ways evident. The price of sin is always blindness, among other things. In verse 4, Jesus Christ is called that spiritual rock which followed them. All Israel shared equally in his providential care. All Israel received the manna and the water. Their reactions, however, varied. We face again the mystery of human responsibility and divine predestination. We must affirm both in order to believe and to understand the faith. To make it an either-or matter is to deny the faith. God determines all things, and yet man is still responsible. A mystery, but so is so much in the world. To make it easy to understand is to deny the faith. We cannot say it is true because we understand it, but we believe because God has so ordained it and declared it, and therefore let God be true and every man a liar. That was a bit of a ham there at the end. Okie dokie. Well, why do these things happen? Why is it there? So, again, terribly important. Terribly important. Why? I should fix that setting, I'm sure. All right, so I hope you benefited from that. Don't see why you shouldn't have, despite myself. All right, thanks very much, folks. See you in the next one.